Now, if you've watched The Office, you know that the majority of the comedy comes from all the awkward and uncomfortable situations that Michael Scott creates and most likely creates for himself. He puts himself into most of those situations. My friend was saying that he can only stand to watch so much of the show because he finds Michael Scott really annoying and his character traits really start to grate on him after a while. I thought this was interesting because I do not interact with the show in that same way. Now, that is not to say that if Michael Scott was real and a human person that I had to interact with at work every day, that would not be incredibly taxing, because it would be. But when I watch The Office, outside of laughing a lot, I find myself feeling sorry for Michael. I have sympathy for him. He wants nothing more than to have friends. He wants to have and feel a real deep connection with the people in his life and to grow those relationships into something that really matters. He wants it to be something that lasts. And while his intentions might not always be pure, I think this is the root of almost all his actions on the show. It is certainly the reason he decides to throw such an incredibly awkward and ill-fated dinner party. And if you've seen the rest of that episode, you know it is incredibly ill-fated as a domestic disturbance breaks out and the police have to be called. Not what you call an ideal situation for a dinner party. I think we all long for this type of meaningful relationship that Michael Scott longs for. We want friends to care for, and we want friends that'll care for us. We want to be part of a community that spends significant, purposeful time together. Michael Scott may have gotten a lot of things wrong over, 9 seasons of The Office? But by throwing a dinner party here, I think he did get one thing right. You see, there are many different ways we can build and cultivate relationships, but they all come down to spending quality time together. And with them all boiling down to spending quality time together, we find that there's something special and unique about sitting around a table and sharing a meal together. Whether in a coffee shop or a fast food restaurant, a 5-star steakhouse, or at your own home, the table is built for something more than just consuming caffeine or calories. The table is built to help us fill that longing for relationships and community. What is it about a table that beckons for this to be used for this type of connection? What does God say about how we can intentionally use our time around the table to build that kind of community He's designed all of us to be in? Throughout the Bible, the table is used as a space for growing close to others. So how can we use the table to build togetherness and connection with others in a way that feeds our soul just as much as it feeds our bellies? We're starting this new series this week, The Table. And this series is designed to help us reclaim the table from a place where we just do our homework, or where we let the mail pile up, or where we eat ramen by ourselves, into a place where God brings forth purpose and life into us and the people in our lives. To do this, we must examine the characteristics of the table, how God designed it to be an integral part of our lives, and how Jesus used meals to help bring people closer to Him. And it all starts with a promise, a simple yet immense promise. Jesus made this promise to us as His followers. For where 2 or 3 gather together as my followers, I am there among them. Some translations have it where 2 or more are gathered. I think the sentiment is the same. Not only is Jesus promising to be present when we gather together, but He is telling us that it is important to gather. And one of the most common ways we gather together is around a table for a meal. But what is so significant about that? Well, first of all, every table and every meal, it ultimately starts with one thing: food. What is it about food that brings us together? Yes, it is a basic necessity. We all need some sort of minimum combination of calories to make it through the day. But food provides more than a physical sustenance. It promotes community. At a time when our society segregates and separates us in every way possible, whether by race, class, age, ability, education, any number of other things, when we gather around a table, something amazing happens. We become equals. There's no us versus them. There's no him versus her. There's no old versus young. There's just people who need to eat. The ingredients on our plates initiate a common connection between us and the earth, and between us and each other. But sharing meals together is kind of becoming a lost art. Mealtime used to be this very sacred thing, but for so many, sharing a meal together now falls in the few and far between category of life. Our lives in society are incredibly fast-paced. We fill up our time, cram our schedules with so many things, work, school, extracurricular activities, that dining together has become a luxury and a lifestyle choice that many of us just can't afford. How often do we take food with us on the go when we're hustling to class? Or do we eat alone in our room while we're cramming for a test? How often do we eat at our desks instead of in the break room with our coworkers? How often do we eat in front of the TV instead of at the dinner table with our family? At the table, we share stories. We build upon relationships. We learn from each other's mistakes, and we learn from each other's triumphs. In doing so, we create the bonds that define us and contribute to every aspect of our well-being, our emotional, our physical, our spiritual, and our intellectual well-being. Breaking bread together breaks down barriers and builds connection. The early church modeled this for us. They worshiped together at the temple each day, met in homes for the Lord's Supper, and shared their meals with great joy and generosity, all the while praising God and enjoying the goodwill of the people. 2 or more were gathered, so Jesus was there when they shared this time together. And we shouldn't be surprised that God has a way of showing up at tables. Sharing a table is one of the most uniquely human things that we do. Think about this. No other creature outside of, say, a children's book or a Disney movie consumes food at a table. Sharing tables with people reminds us that there's more to food than fuel. We don't just eat for sustenance. I don't feel like it's a coincidence that at the center of the spiritual lives of God's people, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, there are tables. We have the table of Passover and the table of communion. There is a spiritual significance to what we eat, where we eat, and with whom we eat. God understands this, and Jesus modeled this to us many times throughout the New Testament. And Jesus brought together both of these two tables, the Passover meal and the communion, together in what we know as the Last Supper. He was celebrating the Passover meal with his disciples when he revealed to them what was about to take place. New Testament scholar N.T. Wright captures the importance of this in this way. When Jesus himself wanted to explain to his disciples what his forthcoming death was all about, he didn't give them a theory, he gave them a meal. Jesus could have chosen any number of situations to reveal the details of his suffering and death to his disciples. But he chose a meal, specifically the Passover meal, not only to fulfill the scriptures, but because he knew his disciples would be present and attentive around this table. In Matthew's account of the Last Supper, he writes, while they were eating, Jesus took a piece of bread, gave prayer and thanks, broke it, gave it to his disciples, said, take it, this is my body, and eat it. There's a pattern here, pattern of blessing, breaking, and giving. It is one that we see Jesus use multiple times throughout the Bible. And I think these three things can give us a great insight into the importance of the table. First, the table is a place of blessing. I want you guys to take a moment with me here. We're going to get a little interactive. Take a moment and think about your favorite food. If you have favorite food, I don't think it'd be very hard to think. So what things do you associate with this food? Are there sights? Are there sounds? Are there people? The longer that you think about this food, can you almost taste it in your mouth? Okay. Does anybody want to share what food they were thinking of, what their favorite food is? Andrew? Italian beef. What does Italian beef make you think of? Yeah. Yeah, it's good. Are there any people or certain places you associate with it, or you just love Italian beef? Best Italian beef. Yep, awesome. So for me, not too dissimilar from Andrew, I was thinking of my all-time favorite pizza, thin crust with Italian sausage from Maria's Pizza in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So good. Oh. I have great memories of going to Maria's Pizza with my family on family vacations as a kid, sharing a pizza with my whole family. My dad and I actually had plans to go back in September when we were in Wisconsin. And I was super pumped because I think it's been about 7 years since I've eaten at Maria's Pizza. But alas, we showed up and there was a sign on the door that they were closed for the week. They're a family-run restaurant, and I guess family-run restaurants need vacations too, so they closed for the week. It was definitely a bummer for sure. Well, I was born in Milwaukee. I wouldn't necessarily claim it as home, but even right now, as I can kind of taste Maria's Pizza in my mouth, it tastes like home. And I was really looking forward to tasting home on that trip back in September. The power of memory combined with smell and taste is a wonderful thing. God has blessed us with an incredible sense of taste. Let's think about it. Humans have approximately 10,000 taste buds. The only explanation I can think of to why this is even a thing is that God really loves us. Like he really loves us. God didn't have to make us capable of experiencing such delight with food. He blessed us with joy through eating, and we can in turn bless others we invite to share our table in the same way. Think about this. When you find a new killer recipe or you find this new amazing restaurant, you almost immediately want to go tell somebody about it. We are blessed by the meals we experience, and we in turn can share that blessing with those in our lives. We can use these instances to invite our loved ones over and cook that awesome new recipe for them, or we can invite them out to check out that new awesome restaurant with us. They become shared experiences, bonds, and connections that we now have together. And this doesn't have to be too extravagant. I have to go to this super fancy restaurant. It can be quite simple, actually. It can be something even like, dude, did you see that commercial for that new double chalupa at Taco Bell? Oh, that looks so good. I want to go get lunch. It could be something that simple. God can even miraculously redeem a meal at Taco Bell. There you and your families will feast in the presence of the Lord your God, and you will rejoice in all that you have accomplished because the Lord your God has blessed you. When we gather together, we can remember the blessings God has given to us and be thankful for the blessing we receive by eating together with each other in that moment. And when we focus our minds and thoughts on God's blessings instead of our challenges, our minds are renewed and we begin to develop that beautiful mind we talked about in that last series that Jesus says is possible for his followers. And a shameless plug, in a few weeks, we will be talking more about gratitude at the table as Thanksgiving gets closer. So you'll definitely want to make sure you come and check that out. And the weekends before then too. Just keep coming. How about that? Next, the table is a place of brokenness. I know for me, one of the things I'm most grateful for when I read the Bible are all the instances where Jesus shares a meal with flawed and broken people. He shares meals with the outcasts and those that are looked down upon. I can sometimes get too wrapped up in my own head about my flaws, my brokenness, my sin, and it's always comforting to me to be reassured that Jesus will go out of his way to spend time with me. Tax collectors were some of the most hated and vilified people in Jesus' time. The religious leaders of the time would not be caught dead hanging around them. But we know Jesus was a different kind of leader. As he went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? On hearing this, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For for I have come not to call the righteous, but sinners. Jesus calls Matthew, and it's amazing. Without hesitation, he gets up and he follows Jesus. Next thing we know, next thing we're told, they're having dinner at Matthew's house. We don't get any details about what happens from the moment Jesus calls Matthew until dinner, but I think it's pretty clear that Matthew is really excited about what Jesus has to say. So much so that he invites all his friends, many tax collectors and sinners, to join them at this meal so they can have a chance to see in Jesus what Matthew sees in Jesus. Jesus blesses that meal and those broken people because they recognize who he is. They begin down the road of reconciliation and redemption together. And it should be no different for us as well. The table is a place where broken people find connection and belonging. Despite all of our best attempts, we fall short in following Jesus. We desperately need people in our lives that we can share life with, who will journey with us through the highs and lows of life following Jesus. When we open ourselves up to others at the table, we begin to walk hand in hand down this road of redemption together, helping each other every step of the way. Finally, the table is a place of giving. Jesus gave freely of himself, his time, and his godliness to everyone he came in contact with. And he did just this while performing one of his most famous miracles. He withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw the large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You will give them something to eat." We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they answered. "Bring them here," he said, and he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were all left over. The number of those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So at the beginning of this passage, Jesus really seems like he needs to get away. He needs some alone time. He needs some time to rest and recharge. The scriptures seem to imply that he was not yet done with this time of solitude when he notices the crowds begin to gather. Jesus knew that the time spent with these people was more important than his wants and his needs. And when it came time to eat, he gave them a meal so they wouldn't have to leave and wouldn't have to end their time together. He gives freely of himself and his food to bind together these 5,000 plus people in this moment and through this one meal. Obviously, multiplying loaves and 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish to feed such a huge crowd is truly miraculous, and it deserves all the headlines and the thing we remember from this story in this passage for sure. But I was struck by something when I was reading this earlier this week. Jesus does not keep this miracle for himself. As he gives of himself, he equips his disciples to give themselves. You will give them something to eat. Then he gave them to his disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. As Jesus gives of himself, breathing life into us, we are then equipped to give ourselves to our friends and family. We may not be able to multiply all the ingredients sitting in our kitchen to feed 5,000 people, but we can invite our friends over for lunch or for dinner. We can give those we care about in our lives our time and our resources, which come from God anyways, to cook them a meal or meet them for a meal, to let them know that we cherish them and we are willing to give up our own wants and needs to grow closer to God with them, just like Jesus did. So these things I think sound great. We have blessing, breaking, and giving. But what are some tangible things that we can do to help us reclaim the table into a space that God intends it to be? First thing we can do is be intentional. Using our table and meals to strengthen our relationships will almost certainly not happen by accident. We have to be deliberate and intentional about planning these times together with the peoples in our lives. For some of the younger folks here, it is probably easier for you to schedule time with your friends because you see them more often, but it might be a little bit harder to get together with family because either you're all away at school or you live in a different city. And for those of us older folks who may have families, it is probably going to be easier to schedule those family times together, those family dinners throughout the week. But it's probably going to be harder to schedule those times with friends. Erica, Kaylin, and I eat together at the dinner table 3 to 4 times a week as our schedule allows. And that's important time for us, for our family. But Kaylin's young, she doesn't have tons going on, we're all under one roof. It's easy to schedule. Back when I was in college, my friend Ryan and I would grab lunch all the time. Heck, even several years ago, living here in Tucson, it was easy for us to get together and have lunch pretty much whenever we wanted to. But now we both have families, live further apart, and it's harder to do. If we want to maintain that relationship, we have to be intentional about doing so. On a side note, Ryan, we should get together for lunch sometime. It doesn't have to be a full meal. It could be coffee, it could be a snack, it could just be hanging out at a table in the union. Aaron and I are getting together on Tuesday night to hang out for a little bit, maybe grab a beer, but we have to do it later at night after our kids go to bed. That's the time that works for both us and our families, so we found that time and we're making it work. Once we've been intentional about planning our meal together, the next thing we need to do is be present. When we're together visiting and sharing time with our families and friends, we expect them to give us their full attention, but we aren't always prepared to give them ours. Do what you need to do to give your full attention to the people you choose to share a table with. If loud music or noise distracts you, maybe don't go hanging out at the student union at peak lunchtime or meal hours, or maybe don't choose to go to culinary dropout at any time ever if you want to hang out and have meaningful conversation. If you're inclined to check your phone a lot, silence it, turn it off, leave it in your purse, set it on the other side of the room so you're not tempted to be distracted by it. We cannot grow closer together if we are not truly present for each other. When you pray for a meal or when you're getting coffee, ask God not only to bless your food and your time together with whomever you're spending it with, but ask Him to help clear your mind and give you focus too. When we eliminate our distractions and declutter our minds, we are able to fully engage with those around the table and start honestly sharing life. Last thing we can do is probably the hardest. We need to be open. It is very easy to carry on a superficial relationship, but it's a lot harder to have a deeper relationship with somebody. I was talking about brokenness earlier, and I think everyone here this morning, whether aloud or maybe just personally in our minds, silently ourselves, we'd probably agree that we as humans are broken and flawed people. But the hardest thing to do is admit that to a person, especially the people we most care about. We think we will be judged or they just won't understand. But here's the thing, they're broken people too. And God has this beautiful, mysterious system set up where broken people can help broken people grow and change with His help. Remember, where 2 or 3 are gathered, right? And all of this is not to say that every time we sit down with our friends or family, it has to be some heavy, deep conversation where we're digging through the ugly parts of ourselves. We are more than the sums of our flaws. We are joys and dreams. We are triumphs and accomplishments. We are laughter and silliness. And it all needs to be shared to know someone deeply and to be deeply known. Conveniently enough, we have an opportunity coming up next weekend to put all of this in practice. Every so often here at DR, we have what we like to call an all-church dinner. It is literally exactly what it sounds like. The whole church gets together and shares a meal and builds community. Pretty convenient that we have this happening right in the middle of this series about the table, right? It's almost like we planned it that way. The specifics are in your meeting that you got this morning. as you walked in, and we'll be talking about it again here in a little bit at the end of service when we have announcements. But I implore you to join us. Come take the first step into a little bit deeper community. Eat some good food, have some fun, and get to know our community better. Erica, Kaylin, and I will be there. We don't always make it to many of the all-church dinners, but we will be foregoing watching the Packers on Sunday Night Football next Sunday to join the all-church dinner because it is that important. And if you know us, you heard people laugh or gasps, you know that skipping a game is a big deal for us. So I am hopeful that I might be able to convince Ben it's at the Phillipses, have him put it on the background or something, but that is not a deal breaker. Ben says, I'm not putting on the game, we will still be there. I want to be able to help our community grow closer together by getting to know many of you better. So I am committed to the all-church dinner next Sunday, and I hope you are too. And speaking of get-togethers, Eric and I actually just hosted a little dinner party of sorts ourselves, and luckily, it did not go like The Office. No uninvited guests showed up. The police didn't have to be called. That was good. It was all happy times. My good friend Mike Check was in town a few weeks ago and got to enjoy the luxury of staying at Casa de la Chinaki and sleeping on the finest air mattress we could borrow. If you were at Story Slam, you may have met him or noticed him join the band on the last song of the evening. Or you may have noticed that Sunday, some silvered-haired fox hanging out at church that Sunday that you didn't know. Mike used to live here in Tucson, but he moved to Georgia 10 years ago when he got a new job. He came to DR when he lived here, and he helped out with music back then. So he knew some of us old folks that had been running around here for a while and wanted to make sure we all got together while he was in town. So Eric and I took it upon ourselves to potluck up a taco bar and get together so we could all catch up. Not gonna lie, tacos were pretty great. But what was even better was the time we spent together as friends. I had to take a moment that night and just step back from the group and marvel at what was happening in our kitchen. There were all these friends from all sorts of backgrounds sitting at our kitchen table. There were kids eating and playing that night that weren't even born yet the last time we got together. There was Megan Miller there investing time in my sister and vice versa. And there was this group of people growing more closely together over delicious, delicious tacos. This made me reflect on all the meals I've shared with these friends over the years and how impactful those interactions have been. And it made me reflect on and appreciate all the more my friendship with them, and especially my friend Mike. Mike and I first met when we were introduced over a meal at a Chinese buffet here in town. Mike would always bring the coveted shrimp ring to any and all DR potlucks that we'd have when he lived here. It literally wasn't a DR potluck if there wasn't a shrimp ring. And he totally brought the shrimp ring to our house 2 weeks ago. There were tacos and a shrimp ring. It was awesome. We've shared countless meals together since. And it doesn't matter how much time passes between seeing each other in person, we're still stronger for having shared those meals together. We've had spiritual conversations, we've had philosophical conversations, we've had serious conversations, and we've had a boatload of silly and absurd conversations, but none of them were wasted conversations because as our friendship has grown, we've been intentional with our time and conversations while sharing meals. It was a beautiful, God-honoring moment reflecting on all of this at our party. This is the kind of connection that being intentional with our time around the table can bring. That even after 10 years apart, you can pick right back up like no time has passed at all. 17th century writer Francois de la Rochefoucauld said, I knew I was gonna mess it up, so I leaned right into it. That guy said, to eat is a necessity, but to eat intelligently is an art. Let us be intentional and intelligent about what we eat, where we eat, and with whom we eat. Let us reclaim the table to a place where we share life with the most important people in our lives, where we invite God to move and work and bind us together in his name. Let's build the connectedness the honor the blessing, embrace the brokenness, and give freely the gifts God has given to us. Let us begin to gather at our tables in our lives with purpose and commitment, and not just for calories.